we start. What we're going to do today is debate the topic, the proposition, the world needs a sovereign debt bankruptcy process. And the way we'll do it is we'll ask for a vote first, for or against, no position. Then each of the presenters will have 7 minutes. I'll ask them a bunch of questions. We'll ask you to join in questions, maybe in writing. We'll see how that works. And then at the end, we'll give each of the presenters a few more minutes to summarize. And then we'll take another vote to see if either of the presenters have changed your mind and persuaded you to their position. So this is a subject that we've spent the last 20 years talking about. And frankly, we don't have a lot of progress to be proud of for all our efforts. And we're fortunate that even though there's strong disagreement today, the subject is really on the table. So it is time for this debate. It is time to take these ideas and turn it into action. So this is quite timely. So we will start with the proponent of this proposition and ask Matthew to begin.
Thank you very much.
May I intervene in a pre-debate poll?
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Thank you. We already jumped ahead. A pre-debate poll. How many people agree with the proposition that we need a bankruptcy process, a structured bankruptcy statutory process? Raise your hand. Yeah, let's just add them up. Okay. How many people think we don't need a process? 2 votes by the same person. How many people don't have a position yet? Okay. Let's get started. Matthew.
So I can basically see I'm mostly only got votes to lose at this stage. Thank you very much for inviting me to be here. I should say I attended many debates in Oxford of this type. The Oxford Union is famed for them. And they're done in a very kind of schoolboy rowdy way, which I don't necessarily agree with. And unfortunately, that same behaviour translates itself to our parliament, where people frequently try to shout each other down, be extremely rude to each other, and make offensive jokes about each other while they're talking, which I don't particularly agree with as particularly good behaviour. But I'm glad I'm here for an Oxford debate. I want to start off by saying, I want to say 3 things. Why this is an important thing to support. Secondly, what do I really mean and how it would work? And then thirdly, begin to answer some of the objections to it, which are often put out by people, and which I don't think are particularly valid. So why do we need a sovereign debt bankruptcy procedure? First of all, people might think there isn't a debt problem. Most of the people in this meeting might not think that, but in a broader audience, they might think there's not a debt problem. There is a massive debt problem in the world, notably in many European countries, but also in many small island developing states, in many middle-income countries. We've just been doing recent analysis for various international organizations showing that the debt crisis is coming back. The debt burdens are growing. And we had a procedure for dealing with heavily indebted poor countries a few years ago, which has sort of been abolished at the moment. It's in limbo. It's been put into suspension, which did quite a lot of what I'm going to suggest, but never quite got there. Secondly, why do we need a statutory procedure? And I'll come into this in more detail in a minute. But essentially because what we have at the moment doesn't work very effectively. And it doesn't work for 3 reasons. One, it doesn't work to actually prevent countries getting into debt crisis in the first place. And when they are beginning to have a debt crisis, like accumulating arrears and so on, it doesn't work to actually stop those arrears getting reduced or eliminated. Encourage those arrears to get reduced or eliminated and stop them from accumulating. It doesn't work to stop people in the countries suffering because all the budget is being diverted to paying debt. And then goes on into not being the current system a very effective or efficient system, so that it takes a very long time to work, with a lot of conditionality for the countries, with a great deal of delay in finally resolving their debt problems. And finally, it completely fails to prevent what are known as holdouts, people who don't want to provide any relief to a country, from pursuing legal action thereafter to essentially steal money from the countries if they weren't the original creditors. In some cases they were the original creditors, but very often they're buying up debt. People have heard of vulture funds asking for multiples of 5 or 10 times what they paid for the debt to be paid to them. So the current system completely fails to resolve all of those problems. The other reason why we need a debt bankruptcy process, frankly, is that we're all heading into, and the main subject of these meetings is the Sustainable Development Goals and the post-2015 agenda, and how are we going to pay for that. And the way that people are suggesting that we pay for it is, if you listen to a lot of the mood music, increasingly through the private sector. I totally agree that the private sector needs to play a strong role. Private sector is vital to global development. However, what in many cases that means is some extremely expensive and rather difficult to restructure means of financing. So you have things like international bonds, you have things like public-private partnership agreements, you have private sector bonds which governments are being asked to guarantee. All of those are much less easy to deal with than the traditional types of debt to the World Bank or to Britain, or whether they might be able to take political decisions to restructure. So if we fund the SDGs in the way that a lot of people are proposing, we will have bigger debt problems which are less easy to resolve unless we have a comprehensive process. So those are the reasons why. The what, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because a lot of this has been discussed for many years, as you said. There was a proposal by the IMF to have an SDRM, a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. There are proposals being discussed in New York at the moment to have a UN-sponsored fair and transparent arbitration procedure. There are a lot of proposals being put on the table. But essentially, I'm not a person who is wedded to institutional homes for this. I don't particularly care whether it's done by the UN or the IMF. I don't particularly care whether it's done in a way which is, with everybody open up to everybody in a totally transparent way, so that civil society are playing a leading role. What is vital is that the sovereign debt bankruptcy procedure gives priority to making sure that countries have enough, and people in those countries have enough money to pay for the Sustainable Development Goals, if we were doing it now, the MDGs, and making sure that it gives fair treatment and comprehensive treatment to all creditors. At the moment, it doesn't. A lot of what's happened over the last 15 years has been the public sector bailing out private sector creditors in various ways, notably in Europe at the moment. So what's essential is that we have an efficient and effective process which stops countries getting into a debt crisis, stops the debt crisis getting worse when it first starts, resolves it quickly, and resolves the holdout. So for me, actually, the most important pillar of a sovereign debt bankruptcy process ought to be that a large number of countries pass laws, which we've already done in Britain, and there's been a long discussion in Congress here, saying that everybody must contribute on an equal basis to debt resolution, and there must not be vulture funds allowed to get a great deal more money than any other creditor is. There's a law in Britain which says you cannot get more money than any other creditor got proportionally to your share of the debt, which stops everybody going to court and making these lawsuits happen. So for me, that's almost the most important thing that we should be doing as part of a bankruptcy process, to say every country should have a law which gives legal force to current debt reduction mechanisms. Finally, a couple of things on what kinds of objections there are to these proposals. So people tend to say that having a bankruptcy process like this would undermine international commercial law and property rights. I don't believe that's the case for 1 minute. There's a bankruptcy procedure in most of our countries domestically, which is not seen as undermining commercial law or property rights at all. They tend to say that it might deprive developing countries of money. And I don't think there's any evidence for that. When we were starting the whole HIPC debt relief process, in a lot of countries there was a bit of doubt as to whether they wanted to be involved in this, and they said, could we test opinion with the private sector? The almost unanimous opinion of the private sector was the lower your debt burden, the more money we'll be prepared to give you. So we'd rather you got more debt relief up front. Notably, I think in Bolivia we consulted the private sector and found that. They would undermine consultation of creditors' confidence in the markets. I don't think that's the case at all. A more transparent, open procedure. A lot of what one hears from the private sector about market-based solutions, including the Sovereign Debt Forum, with which CG has been involved, is about, could we please have more information? Well, the transparent bankruptcy process would give everybody that information. They also, I don't think, would take away sovereignty from a debtor. They wouldn't undermine contributions on a fair basis. In fact, they would enhance those. And I think they would promote domestic financial markets. And in terms of who else supports this idea, finally, not a lot of people say it in public. I think it would be fair to say, my understanding is a lot of staff members of the Bretton Woods institutions, including at very senior levels, support this idea, but would not necessarily say so because of what some members of their boards would say. And a lot of developing countries would say it. Indeed, I've been on panels here where some have, but don't say it quite so loudly and publicly because they are not wanting to look like they're about to go bankrupt themselves. So I think there's a huge amount of support for this. However, indeed, what we need is to make sure that this is a proposal which moves ahead with a lot of political will at a senior level, and I hope that will happen in New York and Washington over the next 12-18 months as part of the Financing for Development process, because then I think a lot of people will jump on board and use that process once it is established. Thank you.
Thanks.
Very effective. Rob?
Well, thank you all for coming very much and for letting me participate. Let me just start by saying the first thing Martin said, I totally agree with. The world is awash with debt. Sovereigns, their banks, their corporations, and many households have way too much of it. Legacy, importantly, of the Great Recession, as well as other factors, which Martin touched on. We are going to be dealing with that overhang. We are going to be restructuring it for some time to come. I think we agree on that. But the debate here today is not about that. The debate here today is whether we want a statutory debt restructuring mechanism, which many people in many forms analogize to like a bankruptcy court. That would be an overarching international forum where these debts are resolved versus what's being done now, which are market-based exchanges. And I feel very strongly there that Martin's on the wrong track on that regard. Now, essentially, in terms of the introductory remarks, it's really 3 points to keep in mind. The first point's a cheap point, but I'm going to make it anyway. It isn't going to happen. The major industrial countries, major money centers, and particularly the United States, are simply at this stage unwilling to sacrifice national sovereignty over their own domestic laws for the sake of an improved international debt environment. We saw that in the debate of the SDRM in the early 2000s, and we see it time and time again. And indeed, Argentina, the problem is indeed the unwillingness of the U.S. courts to delegate those authorities to an international body. And if anyone who follows the Hill here knows that the environment for doing such things, letting international agencies take over national function, is very limited. It isn't going to happen. But we shouldn't stop there, because we're here to debate what should be good policy, not just what will be good policy, so I take the responsibility. But my argument really is twofold. First and foremost, where I disagree with Martin is I think actually the current system of market-based exchange restructurings works pretty well at arbitrating between creditors and debtors when there is financial distress. And that any structural system of the sort Martin's proposing could very easily do more harm than good, that we are trying to get a balance between a market that does provide capital to countries in good times and has to do so by protecting the rights of creditors, which ones that also allows for a ready and efficient restructuring process in times of distress. It's always a balancing act. There's no way of avoiding that. And indeed, I think tough decisions have to be made, which are not going to be solved by any kind of mechanism. Let me just make a few other comments on this. The strong evidence, the market-based restructurings, how do we get these done? Well, it's evolved over time, depending on the interest. In the 1980s, we called all the banks into a room, and we twisted their arms, and we told them that the regulators would be visiting them if they didn't participate. I was fortunate enough to be involved in that on one side of the table before I later went to the markets and went to the other side and complained. Where I stood depended on where I sat, honestly admit that. But in the 90s, as bonded debt became more important, we had to develop new techniques. And we did beginning in 1999. It was a set of new legal mechanisms for restructuring those bonds. It was strong official sector support for countries that were working collaboratively with their debtors to essentially twist arms and have these to occur. And there is a vast body of academic literature which says, first, that it has allowed the vast majority of creditors to finance recovery and to achieve their macroeconomic objectives, to get the financing they need to support the programs that they are implementing in the vast, vast majority of cases. Secondly, holdout lawsuits have not disrupted the economics of sovereign debt restructuring. And indeed, as Anna Gelper has emphasized, sovereign immunity is a serviceable shield for creditors. It does disrupt the politics. Absolutely, and we see that very much in both Greece and Argentina. So-called vulture capitalists, I don't like that term, but we'll use it here today. Vulture capitalists vulture creditors can have strong political consequences. I think there's a lot more we can do, even without a sovereign debt restructuring for that purpose. But we are getting these deals done in virtually all cases, and I would argue the cases that we aren't getting it done prove the rule. The two most prominent, the ones that we are struggling the most to address right now, are Argentina and Greece. And my bottom line on each of those, Argentina, while I have great sympathy for the current government, it was 10 years of poor policy choices and conscious antagonism of U.S. courts that led this judge to create a new remedy to punish them and to bring them to the court and to work with his creditors. It's bad law, I am told by the lawyers. I respect that, but there are a lot of ways we can work around it, and in fact, we have already introduced new language to get around that ruling. Greece is a whole other issue. This has really nothing to do with what we're talking about today. The reason Greece did not restructure in 2010 was because the official creditors that supported them, the European official creditors, did not want to acknowledge that sovereign debt in Europe was not 100% good. It was a dispute within the official sector over whether or not a country in the Eurozone could restructure. Yes, Greece was too little too late, but having an SDRM or something like that would not have solved that because the European creditors, who presumably would have been involved in any kind of structure decision, didn't want it to happen. By the time they came around to acknowledging the necessity of a Greek restructuring, a lot of creditors had fled. They weren't involved. It didn't have to happen. We had the tools. We didn't have the political will. I don't think any kind of new legal mechanism would create that will. Ultimately, we have to make these kind of choices. We're going to have to decide when a country needs to restructure and when it doesn't. I view these decisions are inherently judgmental. You're never going to be able to get a simple rule that says, okay, debt is above a certain level, now we restructure. It's always going to have to take into account a broader range of factors. We see this in Ukraine. No single number is going to tell you that Ukraine desperately needs a deep restructuring of its debt. I agree with that, actually. But any kind of these formal SDRM is probably going to have to put in rules and replace a discretion. Somebody's going to have to make that choice, and ultimately those choices will probably make one side or the other feel disadvantaged and unwilling then, therefore, to participate in markets in good times. There is a lot, as I said, that can be done. We've changed the language. We need to do more to get that language in the new bonds. IMF policies need to be adjusted to make it easier to do the restructurings early on, or at least keep everyone in the game, what the IMF calls reprofiling. And we need to give better rules for when there's such systemic consequences that we need to not restructure. So in summary, to go back to where I started, the debt is too high. We're going to have to deal with that. We need restructurings. We need standstills, but a sovereign debt bankruptcy mechanism is not the way to do it.
Thank you, Rob.
You know, you're both talking about mechanisms to bind creditors, essentially. One is by consensus and collective action clauses and documents, and the other is through a bankruptcy type process where a majority, quote, vote will solve the problem. But the recent papers that have been written on this subject, IMF, other think tanks, really say the real problem is we start too late and we do too little. So by the time we get to the table and we start cutting deals, the country's so sick, it's gone down so far that you're dealing with the tail end of something, not the real problem. On listening to you both, I'm not sure I heard anything in the two proposals you're talking about that address that problem. How does I'll turn to you first, Matthew. How does a statutory court, similar to our bankruptcy court, address the problem of too little, too late?
I think it's really important to realize what currently happens in detail, which is, as my opponent suggested, that people take judgmental decisions on subjective decisions on when it would be appropriate for a country to have its debt restructured and by how much and from what creditors and so on. And that we managed to get away from that a bit in the heavily indebted poor countries process. And we also have got away from that in regard to official creditors in terms of the Paris Club and so on over the years. So the way that the international community has tried to stop things being far too little, far too late, is by increasing coordination and is by setting rules for the levels of debt that imply that a country needs restructuring. And I think those are both very important principles which should have been applied in the case of Greece and would have stopped Greece from continuing in a mess because some particular creditors wanted to hold out. And I'm not saying we're doing this process to attack private creditors. I'm saying we're doing this process to bring all creditors in at an early and in a early stage and in a fair way. If you want to have a proper way of doing this early and comprehensively, you need a bankruptcy process. What is happening at the moment is everybody is taking different decisions about countries with different income levels, about countries in different circumstances based on lobbying by different types of creditors, about whether a country should have debt restructuring. And for me, the most important thing, and why I agree that it's a real problem that needs to be overcome, is that this is at the cost of the people in those countries. So that we are not just talking, and I really disagree with my opponent that the current system is working in its ability to solve the economic problems of debtors and be fair between creditors and debtors, because it is the people in the debtor countries who are paying massive costs of this. In Greece, whatever you may think of their past economic policy, people are currently paying massive costs in terms of their health system, their social welfare system, and that's unacceptable. In developing countries for years, we don't see that from a DC perspective. People have been paying the cost of this. What I'm proposing is if you had a statutory bankruptcy procedure where you said there are levels of debt, and when countries get to those, we have ways of judging that, which the IMF and the World Bank already apply in terms of the debt risk of countries. When countries get to those, they should automatically have a bankruptcy procedure which takes over and makes sure we deal with things quickly. We would not get into that situation. I've just come from Ghana, where they've gone through exactly the same situation again. Their debt burden gradually growing. Last year it was 30% of their budget. This year it's 40% of their budget. Everybody went, we have to now drop all our spending on agriculture, health, education and so on because of this. And the rest of the international community sat there and said, oh, well, we can't do debt restructuring for you because we've already done HIPC and HIPC doesn't exist anymore and there's no statutory procedure, there's no automatic procedure that kicks in. If you had an automatic procedure, you would solve that. You could easily solve the too little, too late problem.
So, Rob, just two things. One, we've had a market system forever, and we just identified, if you accept the IMF paper and other papers, that there's a huge gap, too little, too late, and certainly the market system hasn't satisfied that. So why will the market system satisfy it today if it hasn't over all these years?
Well, first of all, the IMF paper specifically says that they have put aside any consideration of these sovereign debt restructuring mechanisms. They are fully looking at ways in which you can do these market-based restructurings better. And their proposals to do so are twofold. One is fix the language to avoid the problem we ran into, the language of contracts, to avoid the problem we ran into in Argentina. That's been done. I would argue that there needs to be more to get it in that language in all the old debt. And secondly, to change IMF lending policies. And this gets a little bit to Martin's point, so that the IMF itself, at an earlier stage, chooses, working with the country, to say, my lending going forward will be conditional on a debt restructuring. I do think, I mentioned earlier, Ukraine is a good example of the needed flexibility. Last year, I wrote Ukraine needed a debt restructuring. I looked at the war, I looked at the chaos on the ground, the cost to people of the distress there, which to my mind had nothing to do with debt rules, and said they need debt relief for political and economic reasons. They had debt to GDP of 40%. There is no proposal out there where 40% of GDP would have been above that ratio. They would never have qualified by any rule. And indeed, the fund made the mistake of saying, well, it's 40%, we can't legally promote restructuring. In this case, we have to wait. Well, guess what debt is now? Okay? It's more like, if you do it the proper accounting, 150% of GDP or so. And now we just want to try and get it down to 70 or so over 10 years, and we're going to do a restructuring. The restructuring isn't being driven by those numbers. Not that much has changed other than we're acknowledging the costs of the war. What's changed is the political imperative to support Ukraine. I fully support it. But a court judgment wouldn't have done that. What we do need now is for the IMF to be able to say, my lending to Ukraine, this is what they've just said, is conditional on this deal being done. If we don't get relief from creditors, we're not going to lend. Now, that has to be done cleverly because you don't want to give too much leverage to the creditors to hold out. But they're basically, if Ukraine says we're going to stop paying if we don't get a deal, if the IMF says our lending is conditional on a deal, you can get this done through a market-based exchange, and you don't need a statutory mechanism to do it.
Matthew. You're not familiar with the bankruptcy laws of a lot of countries, but certainly the main countries. There is no bankruptcy law in the main countries that requires a filing at a certain point. You're proposing a statutory system that requires an automatic filing. I don't know any creditor group that would agree to that because the circumstances of every case are different, and 9 out of 10 times you're far better off resolving it without a public filing. So why would an automatic filing enhance the system?
I think my opponent just kind of explained why, not necessarily automatic filing, but an automatic triggering of whether a filing was a good idea would enhance the system. It's really good that you identified that Ukraine had a debt problem which needed resolving perhaps before some other people did. But the current system then allowed everybody to dither about it for another 15 months. And I'm not saying that we should only do filings when we can see debt levels above a particular level, because maybe that the current levels as they're calculated are wrong. We also ought to be taking into account factors as we see them arising, like natural disasters, like wars, which are going to hit a country very dramatically and therefore have a very rapid procedure which can apply. I'm not arguing that we have to have a mandatory restructuring. What I'm arguing is that we need a process which says this country needs, from the perspective of the international community, a restructuring. So this country is effectively bankrupt, and therefore we need to consider what we're going to do to get it out of this debt mess. That doesn't necessarily mean that you would proceed immediately to a comprehensive restructuring of a country's debt. What it would mean is that we all have to wake up and do something very urgent and very significant for that country immediately. And it might be that 6 months down the road you had a comprehensive restructuring of the debt. But I agree that having an immediate mandatory filing, some countries might resist it on the grounds that they don't want a mandatory filing, as well as creditors resisting it. So I wouldn't be in favour of something that said the moment your debt hits 40% of GDP, you have to have a mandatory filing. That would be too what's the word, mechanical, but I do think we need something that's much more automatic than the current one.
Classic problem for the IMF. You think about when the IMF goes into a country. When the IMF goes into a country and it's facing an imminent crisis, it kind of has it's at a fork in the road. It can take the view that its money and the policies that are reasonable to ask of the country cannot get it on a viable track. In which case Martin would say, now's the time to start the discussion of debt, and I have sympathy for that point. But they also could say, we believe we can have a catalytic approach. We believe that if we come in with our seal of approval, with our money, with our policy advice, and the country adheres to this, they can work their way out of this, market access can come back, money can flow back, and they will never need a restructuring. And that was the core of the fund's business for many years, and it still remains, in a sense, the better scenario if it can be achieved.
Matthew, Rob, let me ask you a question. You said that nothing would have helped Greece because the Europeans were not willing to even entertain the word at the time.
Absolutely not.
You couldn't use the word.
It had nothing to do with the vultures. It had nothing to do with vultures or credit. This was an issue within the European Union about the response, basically burden sharing. Who would pay the cost of distress?
And I think what's happened is people have realized the fallacy, even the Europeans, of hiding their heads when a restructuring was needed. And they had no mechanism to put it in place, and they had a total fear it would screw up the union. So they didn't do it, and they wouldn't even let the word restructuring be used in.
Right.
But we're now talking about going forward, when we've seen the lessons of ducking your head. And I don't hear anything you've said where the IMF plays an active role, where the IMF does reprofiling, where the IMF get help with going, where the creditors get together and form a committee and do active structuring that's inconsistent with a statutory system that allows it to take place within a framework. So what I'm trying to identify is, what is your objection to the statutory framework?
Aside from the practical elements of getting agreement from
aside from the political.
I think essentially
this is a reasoned debate.
You're creating, if you create a decision maker, right now what's the decision maker? It's a negotiation among all parties, right? In which if the official community decides the restructuring needs to take place, there's a consultation with creditors. It's a negotiation. It can occur through the Gitlin Committee. It can occur through the advisors to the government going out and surveying the market and then deciding on a deal. And I'm saying it works pretty well. It's flexible. It's discretionary. It's not rules-based. And it's not captured by any specific government agent. Actually, my main fear with the statutory mechanism is it would become, to be honest, it would become too easy to restructure, because governments would delay coming to it, but then when they came to it would want very quick relief, and that would destroy the market for debt. And this is a point I think what troubles me with a lot of the advocacy for this thing, is that our goal is a balance between wanting to have a market, and if you make it too easy to restructure, countries won't lend. If you don't allow investors to sell it on to vultures, you're going to have to pay more for it. Now, you may want countries not to be able to borrow so much. There could be some value politically to restricting. But if we believe that emerging markets to develop, to converge to industrial country standards need ready access to capital at low interest rates, you're going to have to allow a market that has sufficient discipline on those contracts that countries have to do a lot to try and pay back.
Okay. Matthew, I'm chairman of the fee committee in Energy Future Holding. It's about a $50 billion Chapter 11 out of Texas. So we have to look over the fees. Now, the reason there's a fee committee is because the fees are enormous once you create a statutory system. You get official committees, you get multiple professionals, you get multiple investment bankers, you get a court system that requires money. And it's clear a system is no panacea, can be very expensive, and can end up being more bureaucratic and delay the process in some cases because the litigation rights of the parties within the system. Isn't a statutory system at risk of making it more difficult to restructure than easier?
Yeah, I want to come back on a couple of points because you let him come in on mine. First of all, I think we really need to get away from will this happen? I agree that it almost certainly will not happen in the current political climate. It might well happen if we have another financial crisis, which we may not be too far away from. But it's about whether we're here to talk about whether it should happen, whether it is a good idea. And my problem with the market solutions is that we have virtually never achieved in history a situation where countries have grown out of debt, except countries like the US, which can print money to do so and run the world's reserve currency. And that we have a large number of interested parties in this who want to pretend that everything can be a lot better. The debtor governments want to pretend that everything can be wonderful in many cases, and they can deliver on their electoral mandates. The creditors want to pretend to their shareholders and so on. So there is an automatic inbuilt bias into the system in saying we must all pretend that everything can carry on being great. And that's why people don't get there in time and don't do enough. To come to your and that's why I think a market solution cannot work, because we have that automatic bias against actually dealing with things efficiently and early. And in the particular case of market-based creditors, we have an incentive, a really perverse incentive for them to lend into these conditions. Because if interest rates get higher as countries get into worse debt problems, then many private creditors, irresponsible ones in particular, will lend more to a country because they can get higher interest returns in the short term. So there's a really bad inbuilt incentives in the system. On your particular fees and bureaucracy issue, it might at first sight appear that setting up a process like this would be bureaucratic and expensive, but nothing is more expensive than the current process we have. There are many countries in the world which have been to get their debt restructured 10 times or more over the years, having to re-incur everybody's time and fees and travel, and in a very uncoordinated way, so they have to go and see creditors in 10 different places with multiple different committees and so on. Having a system which was a bankruptcy process which was coordinated, I think in the long run and in terms of coordination would save us a great deal of money.
Let me just
It's okay.
So let's be clear about what Martin's arguing here. He's arguing that because we do have these debates all the time about what is needed to get a country that's in distress, not just out of distress, but to grow again, and what level of debt relief is appropriate. And there's always this debate I've been in a lot of these discussions, and there's always a debate about how much, right? That you want to reduce the overhang so it's not such a burden on private investment decisions, on policy as well. On the other hand, you don't want to give too much more relief than is needed to alleviate the crisis. And we always have this debate. If Martin is arguing that a sovereign debt mechanism would allow countries to grow, he's implicitly arguing that he wants in charge people who will give far more debt relief than policymakers who then use this market-based approach are choosing to provide. The amount of relief that Greece gave was not limited in any way in 2012 by the tools. They could have gone more, they could have gone less. It was a political decision of how much to ask for. So you could take a view that we will sacrifice the efficiency of markets for the social good of giving much deeper debt relief to countries that get in distress. But don't pretend that it's anything other than that. It's a decision to transfer resources from creditors to debtors, and that will have effects on markets over time.
I don't think there's any evidence to support that. When countries have had debt relief, and there's a lot of evidence from the countries which have had debt relief in the past, if it has been comprehensive, successful debt relief, which hasn't meant just a kind of water torture process where they have to keep going back for more, like Greece is stuck in at the moment, when they've had what I would call proper debt relief, that has had a positive impact on the investment from the private sector, both domestically and internationally. There's no way. I mean, you could take whether you think it's a good idea or not. There are a lot of African countries who are accessing bond markets at the moment. That could never have happened if they hadn't had the comprehensive debt relief that they got, because the markets were saying, and all the credit rating agencies say, one of the main factors they consider is the scale of the debt burden. So I'm not saying you should arbitrarily start confiscating resources from creditors. What I'm saying is when a country gets to a level where its debt burden is clearly unpayable, it is in the interest of all responsible creditors, and there are definitely a few irresponsible creditors who don't subscribe to that, but it's in the interest of all responsible creditors that it receive relief, because that will promote markets, encourage both domestic and international investment.
My My point, I mean, let's follow up on Greece, because you made the statement that Greece is one of those examples of the recurring debt crisis and has too much debt. Be interested in the sense in which you think that's really the case. Let me just make 2 points. One is they have virtually no private debt anymore. The restructuring took out private debtors, gave them a deep haircut, and gave them cash for most of the rest of their exposure. You could have argued they gave them too much cash, but they did. There's very little private debt in Greece. They have huge debt ratios. It's owed to governments. Now, the governments are mainly European, and what they've done is given short-term interest rate holidays. Greece is paying the lowest amount of debt service they have in many of your lifetimes. Okay? They're not paying any debt. They don't have a debt problem in the sense of a budget. Their problems right now are driven by far more fundamental disconnects between what the promises of the new government and what they can pay for. So if we're in what's now, you could say it's still an overhang, it's still a burden, it's an economic burden. I have sympathy for that point. But then what you're really saying is if your mechanism was in place in 2010, let's not wait till 12, they would have come in and said not only deep haircut to the private debt, but we are going to tell Germany and France and the Netherlands that they have to today forgive that debt. That is nothing. That's a political decision. There was no, as Richard said, no appetite for that for fundamental union reasons. And I still don't think, frankly, there's much appetite for that now. And I'm not sure your mechanism would have the political independence to be able to impose that on
So I
those
have to
countries.
jump in, yes. I like this, but I have to jump in. And I have a fundamental question. And this one's for you, Matthew. When you're doing a statutory restructuring of sovereign debt, basically you're trying to figure out what the company can pay, the country can pay down the road, what the country can pay down the road. So right now the IMF does their debt sustainability analysis. Now, I deal with the most sophisticated judges in the world with the most complicated corporate problems. I would not want to trust one of those judges with determining the debt sustainability analysis after hearing expert testimony. So if you have a statutory system, who determines debt sustainability analysis?
I think I have a little bit more faith in judges. I have attended various debt holdout cases, notably in the UK. And the complaint that judges mostly made was we are constrained by the lack of a framework which indicates that we essentially have to pay the creditor everything, no matter how venal they have been in the past. And I think they would warmly welcome the idea of having a better framework where they weren't just obliged to decide in favour of the creditor in every circumstance. But clearly, judges don't decide, and I've been involved in making that type of expert testimony, judges don't decide on the basis of their own personal views. They are supposed to decide on the basis of the evidence presented to them. And clearly, whether you had judges at the top of it or whether you had some other international body at the top of it, that would need to be presented with expert testimony as to why the country could not pay its debt. Now, that testimony would obviously include inputs from the IMF and the World Bank on the macroeconomic front, but it also ought to include testimony on whether the debt burden is undermining the country's prospects of development from citizens and civil society and parliament of that country as well. So you would need more testimony than you currently get. But I don't have a lack of faith in judges' ability to make a right decision, or whoever's deciding, based on proper expert testimony.
But the problem I have with that is we need someone to lend money. The country doesn't have money. Nobody's going to lend money based on the judge's analysis of the debt sustainability. The IMF's going to lend... Oh, I'm sorry. I have it on, but I backed away. Sorry. No one's going to lend money, in my view, based on some judge's decision of debt sustainability. If the IMF is lending money, it's going to be their decision of debt sustainability, which fundamentally brings them right back into the center of the picture. But Rob, I haven't heard anything from you that says, really meaningfully, if I have the IMF doing their role, if I have a better system to organize creditors, and I don't believe there's an adequate system right now to organize creditors and sovereign, and we have a mechanism within to house all that, And we don't just do a bankruptcy system with judges. We take into consideration we have a political issue, we have economic issues. We have to modify it according to the realities of those two. Why not take advantage of a statutory system to fold around that? What am I missing?
I think we touched on it in the sense that you put in place a judge that people don't trust, you'll have devastating effects on the markets. We can do this now through negotiation, through compromise. It requires countries to work in good faith with its creditors and the IMF. And I haven't heard anything that says it would work better in this system. If you put a judge in, they're going to make choices one side or the other, and it will be seen, it'll have very significant effects on the willingness of people to lend or countries to borrow.
Okay, one final question.
And it's of course a rules versus discretion debate in that.
One final question, because I think we've just stretched it adequately. And this is a question I really want the answer to. 25 years ago, we had in the corporate world cross-border cases. No central bankruptcy court. Each country had its own bankruptcy. So when you have a multinational company doing business in plenty of places, what happened was we just liquidated because there was no central place that could guide the Chapter 11, whatever want to call it. We set up vehicles to address that. We used UNCITRAL, we used many other vehicles. We set up organizations. Today, no multinational organization fails because of the lack of an adequate system. We have found ways to put in place systems to prevent that from happening. It might fail because we can't strike a deal, but it's not because of the system. We've made tremendous progress over 25 years in the court. Why do we make no progress in sovereign? You're proposing the market system is still good. You're proposing statutory system. But we don't seem to make any tangible progress that makes a difference for the countries. Yeah, we can put in collective action clauses. Yeah, we can do this. But I don't see anything material that helps a country and its people when they're in trouble not suffer more than they should suffer. Why is it? Why can't we make more progress?
I think this does come back to the politics, and let's be very clear. I'm not advocating arbitrary decisions by a judge. At the moment, what you have, I don't want to say is arbitrary decisions by a judge, but you have decisions by a judge in the context of a total lack of a framework, and therefore the judge is forced effectively, particularly in Anglo-Saxon countries, commercial law, to decide in favour of the creditor. What I'm arguing for is that you would have a bankruptcy process which had a proper framework where everybody knew at which point you needed to restructure the debt and who needed to contribute what, and the judge would make much better informed decisions. Might not be a judge, but if it were a judge, would make much better informed decisions. But, of course, that framework requires politics to make it happen. And as I said at the beginning, I'm not ceding a point on this because it's not about whether this is going to happen, but clearly for this to happen there needs to be a political agreement. We got actually relatively close to a political agreement when Anne Kruger made her proposal. I mean, she wasn't making that in a vacuum. She was thinking that the majority of IMF shareholders, which was the case at that point, would be prepared to support a move towards an SDRM. There were one or two who were very opposed, but there were a large number, particularly in Europe at the time, who were very in favour, and among developing countries. So I think, yes, absolutely, we haven't made progress. We haven't made progress for political reasons. And I think it's not going to be until we have perhaps even bigger debt problems that we make that progress. I note, one can talk about the negative part of Greece. One can also talk about the fact that, I was going to say, on the backs of the Greeks, to some degree, we have actually now managed to build in Europe a much better system for financial stability than we had before, and we could obviously do a great deal more, but we have set up whole new institutions, massive amounts of extra funding to help countries which wasn't there before. So when there is a crisis, you do get that political progress. My answer would be that we didn't perhaps, as they say, you must use the opportunity of a crisis. We didn't use the opportunity of the last crisis quite enough, and we haven't managed to put these things in place. I very much hope that we will, but once again, it's not about whether it will happen, it's about whether it should happen.
But Richard, I'm surprised you say we haven't made any progress. 1984, you had all finance to developing countries came through syndicated loans. Single instrument, very homogeneous creditors. We knew how to do that. We didn't know how to do anything else. I believe that the evolution of the market to include bonded debt has been tremendously powerful for countries that have had good policies in particular, in terms of broadening the base of investors, allowing more capital to go to developing countries at low rates. I think this is a huge benefit, but it's a challenge. How do you restructure it? And initially we had a lot of trouble, particularly early in the 2000s, in figuring out how to do with that. We tried we had Korea was not really like that, but then after that you had a series of countries getting in trouble that had very complex creditor bases, very complex set of instruments. We didn't know what we were doing. We've developed ways to do it, and as I said at the beginning, we have these holdouts, but countries for the most part have been able to get done what the official community in consultation with them decided they needed to get in terms of relief. It does mean you get this sort of group of these antagonistic creditors that hold out and often, after a lot of litigation, a lot of years, get paid off in full. And there's a political pain associated with that in Europe and in Argentina and the like. Keep in mind, though, by the way, the vulture creditors in Argentina have not received a penny and have spent millions of dollars on legal fees, right? They've not received a penny after 10 years. So, my point here is that we actually have learned a great deal about how to arm twist creditors to come along, the vacuum cleaner, to kind of suck up all the creditors when we, the official community, decide what the right level of relief is. So the most compelling stuff I'm hearing from Martin is arguments that we need to change the way we think about what level of relief is needed, not arguments about how we should do it.
Okay. What I'd like to do, thank you. What I'd like to do is just open it up. Do we have any questions from the people here? Anybody want to ask a question? Yes. Would you identify yourself?
Okay. Thanks. My name is Patricia Miranda from the Latin American Network on Debt Development and Rights. I am from Fundación Jubileo Bolivia as well. Sometimes when I have two questions, one for each. First for Robert. Sometimes I feel that when we started to talk about a market-based approach, we tend to, at the end, go to talk about bonds and sovereign debt. And then we started talking about CACs. But that is not just about bonds. There are different types of debt. Multilateral, bilateral, and now we have the private debt through PPPs or other mechanisms. So will a market-based approach will reach all that type of debts, or it's mainly focused on bonds? That is half part of my question. Then I wonder, I'm comparing the debt crisis Latin America had some decades ago with the current European debt crisis. In Latin America, the crisis was mainly because of the interest rates suddenly multiplied by 3. So it was not mainly a debt stock crisis, but it was more an increase of interest rates. And in the case of Europe, it is a stock problem, and I have seen some projections that interest rates might start to go up. So how do you think a market-based approach will address this debt problem in Europe? And for Matthew, well, it's for Matthew, but it's a general comment as well. When I see sovereign debt, sovereign, it's what is the deep word of that? It's people, right? So me as a Bolivian from a country that was a hippie country, well, a sovereign, it's the debt of all people. What happens when it comes from the private sector, and then public sector? It's assuming that private debt, why should be sovereign? What this bond or through PPPs should be sovereign from all people, and from there, there is continuing to what you were saying, Matthew, what do you think about the debt sustainability analysis? Several CSOs have big critics to this framework because it's not addressing the whole debt issue or problematic. So is that an instrument that could tell us in a timely manner when to do something, or do you think other instruments should be addressed, and not just from the IMF, maybe from countries themselves? There have been several initiatives like debt audit in Ecuador. So how do you feel about that? Thank you.
Thank you, Rob.
Well, I think all of Patricia's questions are really good ones. As she said, there's often, and we see increasingly, a continuum of debt instruments. And it's not just bonded debt sold in international markets by Richard. It is local markets. It's PPP. A lot of it, as you said, is contingent debt. It's implicit backing of the government of banks or large corporations that are too big to fail, and those are often the ones that are most explosive in the run-up to the crisis. And I absolutely agree that, well, first of all, I do think in restructurings, and in my world, it has to be case by case. You have to, in each country, say, what are the bounds of what we should be restructuring? And you're trading off the benefits to the country of, say, maintaining trade finance, so maybe we should exempt that, of maybe not restructuring bank instruments because our banks are already insolvent, and there's no point to it, things like that. But we, generally speaking, probably want to have as wide a definition as possible, taking those into account, because the more creditors you involve, the sooner you do it, the more the burden is shared. And I think that's got to be an objective, and I think it's a valuable one. But you're going to see markets evolve, partly in response to policy. And so you're going to have a flexible approach of asking these kind of questions. I do think that the rising interest rate point is the critical policy challenge. We saw a couple years ago when Ben Bernanke started to talk about it, we saw a taper tantrum that had powerful effects on emerging markets. I think we have significant risk of a taper tantrum too. And indeed, the analogy you make to the late 70s, when the U.S. Federal Reserve, much more sharply than we expect now, raised interest rates to bring down inflation and had a dramatic effect on debt sustainability. I think if you look at a lot of these emerging markets with interest rates at 6%, not 1%, in the major, you have a far different world. And I do think, in that sense, and Smith and from Martin's point is we have to have politics that support countries confronting that more quickly and saying, I need to do something different. And if that means restructurings would have to happen somewhat earlier, then they have to try and make that case.
So, if I'm getting you right, you agree that we have a real problem with preventing debt crises and with getting there quickly and with doing enough. So we're sort of partly in agreement that we need a much better process.
I'm in agreement we need much better policies from governments.
Okay.
The governments borrow too much often for political economy reasons. That governments are often then don't want to admit that they're in trouble. They want to put it off. They don't want the elections coming up, or they gamble for resurrection and oil prices will go back up. And there's a lot of reasons why governments delay. And we definitely have to have preventative action in which we try and have dialogue, get governments to confront their economic ills in earlier. In that sense, yes.
And the same could be said of creditors. But I think that just to come to Patty's questions, why we need to change how we do it. And I agree with you that the DSFs are not good enough. In two respects. One, that at the moment you can have countries like Ghana, which last year was assessed as having a moderate risk of debt. I think most people in Ghana would say they have a major debt crisis now. It now has a high risk of debt problems. It's actually already got a massive debt crisis, 45% of its budget being spent on debt service. So clearly the DSF is not managing to stop countries slipping rapidly into debt crisis. And secondly, it has never taken into account what a country needs to spend for the development and welfare of its people, for the SDGs, for the MDGs before them. So it's always been based on ratios, some of which have a good theoretical foundation, others which don't. That's why I said in any process you would need other inputs, other technical inputs to supplement what the DSF has to say. But I really think we need there is a really strong case for doing it differently, not just for having different views of when a country's debt is unsustainable, because the real problem is that even if we agree, and I think if you talked to fund staff members and bank staff members who go on these missions, and they often come back going, we think country X has a real debt problem. And then they go, but there's no way we can really get this sorted out. So they then spend maybe 18 months, 24 months gradually trying to push this up the political tree to get people to deal with it. And that's because the process doesn't work. If you had a process where you could say, as soon as we are aware that we need to trigger discussions about a restructuring, and then you went on to do the restructuring, if that was a good idea, I entirely agree it needs to be not mechanical but flexible and take into account which creditors should participate, not damage the domestic financial system and so on. But if we don't change the consequences of having an unsustainable debt level in terms of the procedure, we really continue to be in the same mess we've been in. And I'm not, let me just say, I'm not arguing for a revolution. We came a long way along this road with the HIPC process, so we had much better coordination among creditors. We had, for the first time, debt relief being decided on the basis of what a country needed rather than just what the creditors felt like giving when they woke up. And we had a faster process than we'd had in the past. Now, I'm just arguing that we really need to make that a great deal more strong and cement it and put in place a framework where you can have a proper bankruptcy.
What I would like to do is take 3 more questions. I see 3 questions. Please be brief. There's 4. We'll see if we have time for 4. But please be brief with your questions and your answers so we can get everybody in. Let's have this gentleman over here.
Okay.
Thank you. The political will.
Identify yourself.
Jacques Bahati, Africa Faith and Justice Network. The political will and the credit worthiness. Why would anybody give debt to a lifelong ruler who is a thief and corrupt? And we know that they are not going to put the money to work for the people, and you call it sovereign debt. Once they die, they have already transferred that money into the pockets of their friends and family members, and then you want the people to. Why should they pay it?
Who would like to do that?
Maybe take
We'll take a minute and then we'll do it? Okay, that's fine.
Hello, my name is David from the Heinz Böll Foundation. So I have a question regarding the too little, too late. So in my regard, we have the trade imbalances in Europe, which really facilitating the debt of the southern countries. And Germany has huge surpluses. Greece had huge deficits, for instance. And so my question is how we can change maybe the trade relationships within the Eurozone to avoid in the beginning these huge amount of debts in there, or is that not the case that this is facilitating the debts? And then maybe if Yanis Varoufakis, who beforehand was an academic writer and professor, and he wrote a lot about surplus recycling mechanisms, and so that there should be an incentive for surplus countries who reach a balance of trade again, so that both the deficit country and the surplus country have these incentive to reach a trade balance.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lara from Global Attitude Brazil. As I'm hearing the discussion, I get the sense that it's kind of a discussion on how to resolve the paradox between accountability and liquidity, or sustainability in loans. And so I disagree with Robert that the market is effective in resolving the debt issues. But the thing is that it's not effective because oftentimes governments or creditors make unresponsible loans because they're seeking liquidity, and liquidity is crucial to development as well. In that sense, I am prone to agree that we need a process, but I'm having a hard time seeing what that process would be if not bailing out the countries that made irresponsible loans. So my question is to Mark that how is that affordable, and who would pay for that?
Okay. We have two more questions. We'll take them quickly and ask the panelists to run through their response.
Thank you. My question concerns the bankruptcy process. And I would be happy to know what will be the consequences of this process for the state. Will it be also a sovereign, or what will be the statement of this country?
Okay, thank you. Did you have one more?
Last one?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yuan Li from the South Center. I would just like to challenge some of the statements, not necessarily a question. And you were saying that the system is working pretty well, and you said that the holdout does not really disrupt debt workout, but it makes debt workout and debt relief very much ineffective. For instance, for the HIPC initiative, there were at least about $2 billion paid to the holdout, whatever you call them. You don't want to call them voucher funds. And these countries are really having very low income levels and below poverty lines. And there were about 22 countries,
So $2 billion for the
22
22.
cases. Sorry?
$2 billion for the 22
Yeah,
together.
That's right. So for some of the countries, it's a huge amount, and they don't have a voice to say that they were suffering from these cases. Remember, Argentina is a big country, and also for Greece, for their debt restructuring, about $6 billion went to the voucher funds. So you have to judge whether it's effective or disruptive or not. Another thing is too little, too late. Greece actually, before their debt restructuring, not only because of European countries didn't want to have it, the Greek government didn't want to have the debt restructuring till the last minute. So they really delayed the whole process. And also, contractual improvements always is after the events. So because the improvements will only take effect after 10 or some years. So
I have to bring it to a close. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
because we only have 10 minutes to answer all the questions. I apologize. So let me ask why don't you start, Matthew?
And then we have to vote
Rob,
again.
You finish, and then what I'd like you guys to do is very quickly answer what questions you can. If we can finish, I'd ask you to do it outside afterwards, but I do want you to each give a couple minute summary before we finish, okay?
So I think a couple of the questions revolved around really how do we hold people responsible, whether it be crooked dictators or whether it be irresponsible lenders. And I think that's really fundamental. And that's another reason for me why you need a statutory process. People often say the same thing about human rights, that once people actually knew there was an international court that could judge you as an ex-dictator, it was supposed to be an incentive for them to behave less badly. And I think there's some evidence that that has happened. Not always, because some dictators think that they'll get away with it anyway. But if you had a sovereign debt restructuring, sovereign debt bankruptcy process, people might begin at least to draw the consequences or the thought that if they lent irresponsibly and if they borrowed responsibly, they would be held more responsible. And I want to make a very important point that I am not arguing that this should be a one-sided deal. I'm not saying we need to have this just so the debt gets restructured. I am also arguing that that should include things like, what are we going to do to repatriate illicit flows? What are we going to do to make the government have a more responsible attitude to economic policy and so on? So I'm not arguing that we should just sort of say, here's a blank check for the government, you borrowed irresponsibly, and now we're going to bail you out and help all your friends who you've given the money to. So it would need to be both sides. And I think clearly, bankruptcy decisions are not just about bailing out the debtor. They are about making sure that measures are being taken to restore the financial health of the debtor as well. Secondly, on the issue of broader and trade issues and so on.
I'm going to skip that because it's beyond the scope of today. I apologize.
Okay. All right.
Maybe you can
No
chat
problem.
about it
No
afterwards.
problem.
Not that it's not important.
All right.
But it doesn't, we're trying to just narrow down
Okay,
this debate.
fine. So then one other thing then, I think about consequences for the country and particularly about the amounts that have been used. So what one often doesn't see is the amount that countries are paying out to people who are threatening to be holdouts. So we know, having worked with all the HIPICs, that yes, there was 2 billion lost through court cases, but there was about 15 billion lost through payouts that were made to stop court cases from ever happening under threat. And that's a lot of money. And equally, the consequences, and I want to come back to this at the end, because the number one reason for having a sovereign debt bankruptcy process is the consequences for the people in that country. 15 billion may not sound like a lot of money, but to the people in that country, in terms of their health and education budgets and what's being spent to help them, it's a fortune.
In every deal I worked on, we estimated a potential number of holdouts. We had a macro objective the fund had given us. We set the number assuming a certain number of holdouts, and so to the extent there were holdouts that got paid out, Peru being a famous example, you know who paid for that? It was the other creditors, through a deeper haircut than they would have otherwise had to do. Several people touched on this idea of accountability, and there is this idea of odious debt, a principle that says that after the fact we can look back and say this debt was lent out for terrible reasons or was badly misused by corruption, therefore should not be enforceable. It doesn't have broad support in the international setting. There's been some debate about this most recently in the Ukraine case in terms of the money that was given to the Ukraine government by Russia right before the political change. It is very much hard after the fact, because if you're coming after the fact and saying these were bad guys, so we shouldn't have to pay it, then you have to ask what will it do to markets before. Other than sanctioned countries, I don't see that there is much inhibition, and markets will lend on the assumption that the sovereign lasts forever. Right? It's a fundamental principle of most countries' laws that what makes the sovereign different, particularly in a world where you can't give collateral, where you can't pledge international assets credibly, right? If you go for a loan, that debt isn't going to outlast you, but we can ask you for collateral. We can ask you for security. I can't do that for a country. So what secures that is the belief that debt is going to survive the leader that borrows it. And so it is a very fundamentally different model if you, in a sense, have to be on a list that says, this is a good guy or this is a bad guy.
So let's have our final comments and then another vote. Fred, why don't you start a couple minutes?
I think what we've kind of agreed here today is that countries make bad choices. Sometimes because they have the wrong leader, sometimes because they have incentives to put things off, to search out for other objectives. And that means that debt crises are going to be with us. There is no end of history here. What we have decided to do, because other governments do not want to pay the full bill, is to create a system in which private capital is asked to provide a lot of the financing for development. And there's a lot of different instruments we can do. We can choose better instruments. PPP should probably be more relied on. But in the end of the day, when mistakes are made, we're going to have a process for fixing it. And my argument is we are actually doing things better now than before, that there are only a couple of cases where things really badly went off the rails, Argentina being most famous, and we have fixed that with new contracts. And there is more we can do. We can get all the old debt to have the new contracts in it. We can change the way the IMF lends so that investors don't believe they will have a bailout from the IMF if the country gets in trouble automatically. And that a lot of the things that were raised today, I think, can be addressed through those mechanisms without fundamentally trying to rewrite the rules of the game for international finance.
Matthew.
I hope that's not what we've agreed today. Because I think that it's really important that we don't take an international creditor community, a Washington-based perspective on this. And often one hears discussions here which forget about the situation in developing countries and forget about the costs that people are paying on a daily basis. It seems to me this is not just about holdouts. This is about the massive costs that countries pay when there is the too little too late, when there are people who refuse to deliver enough relief so they influence the whole structure of what is provided by the whole community. So you can have, if you like, semi-holdouts within the process who are actually saying we mustn't give this country so much relief. And I would apply that word of a semi-holdout even to European instruments, which are institutions which I think did not give Greece enough of a restructuring the first time. So it's not, the holdouts are like the worst example of the process, but there is a constant wish to push back against what a country really needs for its development. And it's not just the countries who make bad choices, it's the creditors who make bad choices, and in many cases among commercial creditors make worse and worse choices the more a country gets into a debt problem. A lot of creditors pile in to lend because they're making more money out of higher interest rates at the point when a country is getting into a worse and worse crisis. So I don't think that it's not just a matter of having a system where we can say more clearly when a country needs relief. It is definitely a matter of making sure that everybody is held responsible. And you cannot do that if people think they can get away with arguing politically for more or less relief on very subjective grounds, with being holdouts, and with delaying the process as long as they possibly can so they can get their own funds out of the country or be bailed out in various ways for themselves. So for me, if we don't have a process, we will carry on undermining the development and the welfare of people in developing countries. There have been 70 countries which have had a debt crisis in the last 25 years in one way or another. And so we cannot just argue that it's Argentina and Greece which are a problem. 70 countries had a problem, and we need to do something to stop that going on.
So it's obvious to me we did not need the smart popcorn for these two guys. I so appreciate the intelligence of this debate and the comments on both sides. I would now like to take another vote. How many people believe we should have a statutory bankruptcy system to resolve sovereign debt?
Before we take the actual vote, could I please pause for a political commercial?
Let's do it. Want to do it after?
No,
Okay.
because everybody's waiting to vote. I have their full attention now. New rules for global finance in collaboration with the Center for International Governance Innovation, thank you, is hosting not one but 4 webinars next week. They're free, they're brilliant, and they're all organized by Nathan Copeland. If you sign on, you tell him that his life and his work are worthwhile. Okay, this is a personal thing for Nathan. Give a vote of confidence in Nathan. Sign up for these webinars. There's a flyer. Brilliant people. Jose Antonio Ocampo, Yuka Lee from the South Center, Anna Gelber. Woo! Brilliant woman. From Georgetown Law, Danny Bradlow from Victoria, and Reza Bakir from the IMF. That'll be a hot one.
I meant to discuss the reprofiling proposal.
Yeah, what are they coming out with that's new? Are they going to support SDRMs? Woo! And we also question, are we closing in on this? Yes or no? Okay, don't leave, you get the vote. Now it's the voting.
Okay.
Right now.
Okay, so we're not voting on Nathan, remember. We're voting on the proposition the world needs a sovereign debt bankruptcy process. How many people support that proposition? How many people believe we should not have a sovereign debt process? How many people are undecided?
I think you had a good day.
Thank you, everybody.
Let's get a hand for Robert.